The farm was quiet, save for the distant hum of crickets and the rustling of the wind through the tall grass. I leaned against the weathered wooden fence, watching the sun dip below the horizon, its last golden rays brushing the barn roof. The days felt longer now, the work heavier. Alone, I had taken to running the farm after my divorce a year ago, but the weight of solitude was proving harder to bear than the physical labor. That's when Mark called. Mark had been my best friend for over 2 decades, the kind of friend who was more like family. We'd grown up together, shared countless beers, and supported each other through life's storms. He knew how much I struggled with running the farm alone, so when he offered a solution, I listened. "Hire my son," Mark had said over the phone, his voice carrying that mix of pride and frustration parents often have when speaking about their children. "He's between jobs, needs something steady. And you could use the help, couldn't you?" I hesitated. I hadn't seen Ethan since he was a teenager. Back then, he was all awkward limbs and messy hair, tagging along whenever Mark brought him around. But Mark assured me Ethan had grown into a responsible young man, eager to prove himself. Trusting my friend, I agreed. When Ethan arrived the following week, I almost didn't recognize him. The boy I remembered had transformed into a confident, broad-shouldered young man with an easy smile. His dark hair was neatly trimmed, his eyes a piercing blue that seemed to take in everything at once. He carried a duffel bag slung over one shoulder, and as he stepped out of the car, he greeted me with a handshake that was firm but warm. "Thanks for giving me this chance," he said, his voice deeper than I expected. "Glad to have you," I replied, trying to hide my surprise at how much he'd changed. Ethan settled into the small guest house on the edge of the property, and by the next morning he was already proving his worth. He worked tirelessly, throwing himself into every task with an energy that I hadn't felt in years. Whether it was fixing fences, mucking stalls, or helping with the cattle, Ethan approached everything with a quiet determination. But it wasn't just his work ethic that caught my attention. It was the way he carried himself, confident yet unassuming. The way he'd flash a quick smile after a job well done or offer to stay late to help finish a task. I began to notice how easily he fit into my world, like he'd been part of it all along. By the end of that first week, I found myself looking forward to our conversations at dinner, his laughter filling the otherwise silent house. For the first time in a long while, the farm didn't feel so lonely. Still, there was an unspoken tension I couldn't quite name, a shift in the air I didn't dare acknowledge. But deep down, I knew this was only the beginning. The rhythm of farm life settled quickly, and Ethan became indispensable. He had a knack for solving problems, whether it was fixing the tractor that hadn't worked in months or calming a skittish horse. He worked with a quiet confidence, and his presence began to fill the empty spaces in my days. One evening, after a particularly grueling day of hauling hay bales under the sweltering sun, we sat on the porch, sipping iced tea and watching the fireflies dance in the gathering dusk. Ethan leaned back in his chair, his shirt damp with sweat and clinging to his frame, and let out a contented sigh. "You ever think about leaving this place?" he asked suddenly, his voice soft but curious. I glanced at him, surprised by the question. "Not really. The farm's been in my family for generations. It's all I know." He nodded, staring out into the distance. "I get that. But sometimes, I wonder what it'd be like to just go. Start fresh somewhere." There was something in his tone, a mix of yearning and uncertainty, that tugged at me. I wanted to ask more, to understand what weighed on him, but I held back. "Instead," I said, "it's not as easy as it sounds. Sometimes roots are all we have." He looked at me then, his blue eyes catching the last light of the day. "Maybe. Or maybe they're what hold us back." The conversation lingered in my mind long after he went to bed. Ethan wasn't just a farmhand. He was searching for something, though I couldn't quite tell what. The days turned into weeks, and our bond deepened in ways I hadn't anticipated. We shared meals, stories, and moments of quiet companionship. Ethan opened up about his strained relationship with his father, how he always felt like he couldn't live up to Mark's expectations. "He's a good man," Ethan said one night as we cleaned the barn, "but he doesn't understand me. He wants me to be like him, but I'm not." I found myself defending Mark out of loyalty, yet I couldn't ignore the ache in Ethan's voice. I saw pieces of myself in his struggles, the longing to be understood, the weight of others' expectations. It created a connection I hadn't felt in years, one that was both comforting and unsettling. There were moments when the air between us seemed to shift, an accidental touch as we passed each other tools, the way his laughter would linger just a little too long. I told myself it was nothing, that I was imagining things, but the thought refused to leave. One night, as we stood under a sky heavy with stars, Ethan turned to me and said, "You're different than I expected. You're easy to be around." I didn't know how to respond. His words were simple, but the way he said them felt like more. My chest tightened, a mix of emotions I wasn't ready to name. And yet, as I looked at him, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were heading toward something I couldn't stop. The storm rolled in suddenly, dark clouds swallowing the horizon and rain slashing against the windows like an unrelenting tide. Ethan had been in the fields when the first drops fell, and by the time he made it back to the house, he was drenched, his clothes clinging to him like a second skin. "Get out of those wet things before you catch a cold," I said, tossing him a towel. He smirked, his hair plastered to his forehead, water dripping onto the floor. "You sound like my dad." The comparison stung, though I wasn't sure why. I waved him toward the bathroom, retreating to the kitchen to distract myself. The storm raged outside, the power flickering once before holding steady. I stirred a pot of soup on the stove, the repetitive motion grounding me as my thoughts swirled like the tempest beyond the walls. Ethan reappeared in dry clothes, his hair still damp but combed back. He sat across from me at the table, the flickering candlelight casting shadows across his sharp features. "Thanks for the towel," he said softly, his voice carrying an edge of hesitation. I nodded, avoiding his gaze. The air between us was heavy, laden with something unspoken. "You're quiet tonight," he said after a moment, breaking the silence. I shrugged, forcing a smile. "Just tired. Long day." He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "You've been different lately. Distant. Did I do something wrong?" The question caught me off guard. I looked at him then, really looked, and saw the vulnerability in his expression. He wasn't accusing me, he was seeking reassurance. "No," I said finally, my voice low. "You didn't do anything. It's just complicated." "Complicated how?" I hesitated, the words tangled in my throat. How could I explain what I didn't fully understand myself? The way my thoughts lingered on him longer than they should, the way his presence filled a space I hadn't realized was empty. The thunder outside seemed to shake the house, but it was nothing compared to the storm brewing within me. "Ethan," I started, but the words faltered. He stood abruptly, pacing to the window and staring out into the rain. "I feel it too," he said, his voice barely audible over the storm. My heart stopped. He turned back to me, his expression a mix of defiance and fear. "I don't know what it means, and I know it's wrong. But I can't ignore it." I rose slowly, the space between us suddenly feeling impossibly vast. "We can't," I said, though the conviction in my voice wavered. Ethan took a step closer, and then another. The distance shrank, the tension crackling like the lightning outside. "Tell me to stop," he whispered. But I couldn't. The moment hung suspended, the world beyond the storm forgotten. I didn't know where this would lead, but I knew there was no turning back. Morning arrived with a fragile stillness, the storm having spent its fury overnight. The sun rose cautiously, its golden rays filtering through the rain-soaked windows. I stood in the kitchen, staring at the remnants of the night before, a pair of mugs on the table, damp footprints on the floor. The air felt different, heavier, as though the house itself bore witness to a secret it couldn't contain. Ethan emerged from the guesthouse just as I stepped outside. He looked at me, his expression guarded, and I felt the weight of unspoken words pressing between us. For a moment, I considered pretending nothing had changed, letting the morning pass like any other. But the tension was too sharp, the silence too loud. "We need to talk," I said finally. Ethan nodded, his jaw tight. He followed me to the barn, where the familiar smells of hay and earth offered a semblance of normalcy. I leaned against a stall door, arms crossed, searching for the right words. "What happened last night?" I began, my voice faltering. He interrupted, his tone firm but not unkind. "It wasn't a mistake." His certainty caught me off guard, and for a moment I couldn't meet his gaze. "Ethan, this is complicated. Your dad—" "My dad doesn't understand me," he said, cutting me off. "You do. That's why this happened." I shook my head, frustration and guilt knotting in my chest. "That doesn't make it right." He stepped closer, his presence both comforting and overwhelming. "Maybe not, but it's real. You feel it too. I know you do." I looked at him then, the sincerity in his eyes undoing me. He wasn't wrong. Whatever this was, it had taken root, growing in the quiet moments we'd shared, in the spaces where loneliness used to live. But acknowledging it didn't make it any easier to accept. "We can't keep this from your dad," I said quietly. His expression darkened, a flicker of fear crossing his face. "You don't have to tell him. It doesn't have to change anything." But we both knew that wasn't true. Secrets had a way of unraveling, and this one would tear apart everything it touched. Later that evening, Mark called. His voice carried its usual warmth, but there was an edge of curiosity. "How's Ethan doing?" "He hasn't been answering my calls." I hesitated, guilt tightening like a noose around my throat. "He's fine. Adjusting well." Mark chuckled. "Good. I knew you'd be a good influence on him." The words hit like a blow, and I could barely respond. After hanging up, I sat in the dark, the weight of what I'd done pressing down on me. Ethan found me there, his shadow stretching across the room. He didn't say anything, just sat beside me, our shoulders barely touching. For a moment, the silence was enough, a fragile truce in a war neither of us wanted to fight. But deep down, I knew the truth would come, and when it did, nothing would ever be the same.